Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics Module 9, Lecture 3. So this module is our introduction to monetary policy, to what the Fed does and how the Fed thinks about the problem of managing the U.S. macroeconomy to avoid the problems of recessions and inflations. The last slide we looked at in the last lecture was the moral of that story, which is by creating more money, since money is used to buy things, we'd expect that if the Fed creates more money, then there'll be more buying and aggregate demand would move to the right. And why would you do that? You would do that to get out of a recessionary gap. And then by the same logic, but in reverse, if money is used to buy things and there is less money, there'll be less buying and aggregate demand would move to the left. And why would you do that? You would do that to fight the problem of inflation, right? Inflation is people trying to buy more than there is, which causes prices to rise. And if you have less money, so you have less buying, then they won't be trying to buy more than there is, and prices will stop going up. Or in terms of the aggregate supply, aggregate demand diagram, aggregate demand goes to the left, and you get back to Q sub n out of the inflationary gap, but without the inflation that you would get with if you just waited for wages to adjust in the normal long run adjustment mechanism. Right? You always get back to Q sub n at the end of the long run. If you're in the inflationary gap and you do nothing, then you get back to it with inflation. If you get back to it by the Fed preemptively moving aggregate demand to the left, you get out of it without inflation. We talked a little bit about Keynesian. Maybe you remember the story of the ferry boat and too much spending versus too little spending. And Keynes thought that what we needed was for the federal government to do more spending or less spending in order to make overall spending about what we want it to be, the amount that gets us to Q sub n. It's the same idea. But in this situation, we're talking about getting more spending or less spending, not by the Fed, not by the federal government spending more or less, and not by the federal government raising or lowering taxes to get taxpayers to spend more or less, but by the mechanism of creating more money or less money. So both expansionary policy and monetary policy have the goal of, when you're in the recessionary gap, increase buying, move aggregate demand to the right, and when you're in the inflationary gap, decrease buying, move aggregate demand to the left. But you get there by two different mechanisms. And what the Fed does is either make there be more money or less money in the society. So that sounds easy. In fact, it sounds too easy. Because if macroeconomics is this simple, you're in the recessionary gap, print up more money, yay, problem solved. And in the inflationary situation, decrease the money supply, less buying, yay, problem solved. Then why do we in the real world have such hard problems with recessions and inflation? So we're going to start now is a discussion that will extend into the next lecture of problems the Fed has in using this simple idea of, well, create more money, more buying, create less money, less buying. And the first problem is one that we've seen before. It was a big problem with fiscal policy. It is a big problem with monetary policy, and that is our old friend, the problem of lags. And there are the same three lags in discussing monetary policy as there were in discussing fiscal policy. I'm sure you remember those all perfectly, so no need for me to go through them. But just on the off chance that you don't, let's remind ourselves what the three major lags are. You have the recognition lag. You have the lag of realizing you're in a recession after you've gone into a recession. And this can take months. It can take 6 months. Because Number one, you're getting the data with a lag. You're looking at old data. You're not looking at what is happening instantaneously, and that's true if you are the president. That is true if you are the chair of the Federal Reserve. And it's also true that in the real world, you often are getting contradictory evidence. So when we went into the big bad recession of 2010, that when that had started in 2008, and we know now in hindsight it had been going on for 4 months, and we have the meetings, we take the minutes of the meetings of the Federal Reserve, and they're not released at the time. They wait years before they release them, but now they've been released. And so we know from the minutes of the Federal Reserve that even though we were more than 4 months had gone by that we'd gone into a recession, the people on the Federal Reserve were still arguing, are we going into a recession or not? In fact, some were still saying that they thought inflation was a bigger problem than recession, that inflation was a bigger danger. And out of this, that at the crucial time when maybe if the Fed had acted aggressively at the beginning of the recession to do expansionary monetary policy, they could have made it a much less severe, a much shorter recession. But they didn't do that because they weren't sure what was going on. And then later they did act aggressively, but in some sense these recessions are like boulders coming down a hill. It's a lot easier to stop the boulder at the top of the hill than once it's halfway down the hill and has a lot of momentum. Then you have the implementation lag of deciding what to do and doing it. This is much less of a problem for the Fed than for Congress. Because Congress, the House of Representatives with 435 people, and the Senate with 100 people, and then of course the President and all these people with conflicting motives and different political situations having to get together and decide on what is the proper fiscal policy. That can take a while, and maybe they can't agree at all. But the Fed is these 7 board members, and including the chair, sitting around a room who are all experts in what's going on and all familiar with what's going on, and they can come to a decision in a morning. They can have a meeting in the morning where they decide what to do, and in the afternoon the chair can order it done, and boom. So the implementation lag is not much of a problem for the Fed. And usually in these kinds of situations, as a practical matter, the chair of the Fed has a lot of authority that the other members defer to him. In theory, the board can go against the wishes of the chair by voting him down, so like vote against him 4-3. In practice, that hardly ever happens. The members tend to defer to what the Fed chair wants. That doesn't mean the Fed chair always gets what he wants, because if all the other members think it's sort of crazy, they might tell him before the thing's even proposed, we shouldn't do that, it's sort of crazy. And so, but they're, in the Supreme Court, they're always having 5-4 votes. The Fed doesn't have 4-3 votes. It's unusual for the Fed to have a 6-1 vote. Usually it is unanimous support of what the Fed chair suggests, though, as I repeat, if enough people are opposed and make their opposition known, the chair usually backs off and doesn't insist upon a vote. And then lastly, we have the impact lag. So the Fed decides to do open market operations and goes out and buys a bunch of securities this afternoon, and this newly created money goes into becoming bank reserves. I say money, I shouldn't say money. It's not money yet. It's not money till it gets out of the bank vaults. It is, we'll call it either bank reserves, or you could call it vault cash. So the Fed creates a bunch of new vault cash or bank reserves. Not money yet. It's not money until the banks loan it out. And remember, so much of the impact of the Fed creating money is not that first wave, but the idea that the banks loan it out and get it back, and loan it out and get it back, and loan it out again. So that over time the money expands much more than the Fed initially created. And the conventional wisdom is that from the time the Fed decides to do open market operations, or remember the other way, they can increase the money supply, they can lower the required reserve ratio, they can lower the discount rate. At least people who have studied this think that from the time the Fed goes out and buys securities or lowers the discount rate, it takes at least 6 months for aggregate demand to move almost as far as it's going to move. And that's only if things happen very quickly. It can actually take up to 2 years. So 6 months to 2 years before what the Fed does have its impact. So the implementation lag is short. That's a couple of hours. But the impact lag of what they do is long. That is from 6 months to 2 years. And the Fed doesn't know which it's going to be, which is also a big problem. So that the Fed has to risk acting either too late or to make predictions about the future and act in anticipation of that, and then risk being wrong. And this is just like fiscal policy. I talked about in fiscal policy, one of the ways I said it was that you know, if you do fiscal policy, if you do expansionary fiscal policy in a recession, and by the time it has its effect of running through all those Keynesian rounds on the table, you're actually out of the recession already, and then aggregate demand moves to the right, and you throw yourself into the inflation problem. You did what was right, except at the wrong time. Except, another way of describing doing what is right, but at the wrong time is just you're doing what is wrong. I discussed also when we did fiscal policy the charge that in the 70s the government was making things worse by trying to make things better because they weren't taking proper account of the lags. And that charge was made against Congress and the president, but even more strongly, it was made against the Federal Reserve Board of the time. And probably the most famous person making this charge was Milton Friedman, who we've met before, talking about monetary policy. And he said that the Fed, they'd see we were in a recession, they'd pump up the money supply. In the year and a half it took to have an effect of increasing aggregate demand, we would have gotten out of the recession by long run adjustment. We're back to Q sub N, and then here comes this big increase in aggregate demand, throws us into inflation. And by the time the Fed realizes we're in inflation, decides to decrease the money supply, the decrease in the money supply moves aggregate demand to the left, because this is a year or two, we've moved out of the inflationary gap back to Q sub N, and then boom, this decrease in aggregate demand throws us into a recession. So that the Fed is like a doctor that examines you, but he doesn't see how you are now, he sees how you were 6 months ago, and the medicine he gives you doesn't have its effect now, it has its effect a year from now, unless that doctor is very careful in taking account the lags of this situation. It would be easy for such a doctor to make things worse rather than better. And if he acted like he saw how you were now, and what the medicine he was giving you would have its effect now, he almost certainly would be making things worse rather than better. And that was Friedman's charge against the Federal Reserve of the 70s, which probably in any ranking of such things would be considered, conventional wisdom of most macroeconomists, one of the worst Federal Reserve boards we've had, maybe only second, well, because of this problem and because of the ever-growing inflation problem that occurred in the 70s that they seemed helpless to fight, or at least they couldn't figure out what to do. So no doubt the Federal Reserve Board of the early 30s, the people in charge during the Great Depression who were so ineffectual in trying to fight the Great Depression, would be considered the worst Federal Reserve Board ever. But I would guess that the 1970s Federal Reserve would come in second place of modern. Well, we've only had the Fed since 1913, so I think that's true. Now, before we go further in discussing monetary policy, I want to get straight a couple of basic things we need to understand about the Fed. First, for analyzing Fed behavior, we need to know their goals. It is generally considered the Fed has the goal of low inflation, low unemployment, and high growth. In fact, the law that creates the Fed says their goals are low inflation and low unemployment. Because since low unemployment's matched in with high growth, we can put that on there too. And this is not new. These are the same three variables that we saw way back when we started getting into macroeconomics of how do you understand, how do you judge if the macroeconomy is working well? And the answer is when you have these three things, the macroeconomy is working well. And if you don't have, if one of them's out of whack, it's working badly. And if two or three are out of whack, it's working horribly. So basically, this is saying the Fed's goals are to have a well-working macroeconomy. So how does the Fed achieve this? Well, this is not new. This is, when we're in a recession, so we have high unemployment and low growth, the Fed does expansionary monetary policy, and in inflation, they would do contractionary monetary policy. Or, they could always just wait until with the natural adjustment of the long run gets us back to Q sub n. Now, while the Fed looks at many things in setting policy, we can't accurately say that for the last 30 years, certainly in this 21st century, the main thing they've looked at is inflation, and that the Fed has a goal of 2% inflation. They judge their performance most importantly by how close they are to setting 2% inflation. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean they try to hit 2% inflation every month, but over the medium term. And what is the medium term? We've done the short term, we've done the long term. What's the medium term? Medium term is whatever the Fed wants it to be. Potentially a fuzzy term to give themselves freedom. So if we look at this blue line, which is the inflation rate, and then that straight black line going across is 2% inflation, and the blue line is what inflation is, you see how it oscillates around 2%. And that's because when it goes above 2%, the Fed has decreased the money supply to drive it down till it gets down to 2%, and maybe they overdo it and it goes a little below. And whenever the inflation's less than 2%, they increase the money supply to get inflation up, and sometimes they overdo it and it goes a little above 2%. But you got this oscillating around 2%, which is exactly what you would expect if they're targeting 2%. All right. This is a convenient stopping place. The next topic will take much more than 1 minute to discuss, so I'm not going to even start it. I'm going to stop here and say you know what to do. This is the first two lectures, so time to read the textbook and then take the Module 9 Quiz 1. I wish you good luck with that, and when you're done, I'll see you for Lecture 3. Until then, take care.